My Grandmother's House is a poem written by Kamala Das. The poem first appeared in an anthology of poems entitled Summertime in Calcutta that came in 1965. It is an autobiographical poem in which the speaker's nostalgic desire for home reflects through the inability to visit the happy past. The poem describes the speaker's happy life before her grandmother's death and sad life after her grandmother's death. The speaker of the poem is a married woman. She is reminded of her parental home, which is the symbol of immense love. The poem describes the clear difference between past and present. In past, the life was full of activity, whereas now it has turned into deadly silence. The intensity of sadness is expressed by dark and negative imagery. Kamala Das is one of the three most popular Indian poets writing in English in contemporary India, the other being Nizam Ezekiel and A.K. Ramanujan. Her poetry is all about herself, her deeply felt desire for love, her emotional involvement, and her inability to achieve such a friendship. In this poem, My Grandmother's House, Kamala Das remembers her ancestral home and her dead grandmother. This poem takes the form of a confession that contrasts her current fractured state with that of being unconditionally loved by her grandmother. The poem starts with the reference of a grandmother as that woman which is particular and who is no more now. The house is now far away, and the past happy condition is irretrievable. The house represents the feeling of love which the speaker could get from her grandmother, but now the house is silent. The poem moves through the happy past and sad present. The poet uses the image of snakes moving among the books now, for which she was too younger in her childhood. Now, very often she thinks to revisit the house, but now it is very difficult to peep through the blind windows. Here, the image of blind windows may represent the eyes which are now visionless. The air is frozen, and now she wants to bring the handful of darkness. The poet uses the simile where she compares herself with the brooding dog who is helpless. The sudden reference to the reader as a darling is striking. The speaker again mentions the love which she once received, but now her condition is like a beggar asking the change of love. The poet, in intense terms, expresses the sadness. The use of language represents the strangeness and unhealthy relationship between people and this woman. Kamala Das's childhood reminiscences are linked to Nalapat House, her family home in Malabar, and her grandmother, whom she loved dearly. These memories are often connected to feelings of nostalgia and wit. In my stories, she writes, From very from every city I have lived, I have remembered the noons in Malabar with an ache growing inside me, a homesickness. Her family home and her presiding deity, her grandmother, symbolize the poetry of joy, innocence, respectability, and traditional values. The house is viewed in this poem with care and pathos, and the poet shares her poignant feelings of yearning for this house. She needs to get back to it. The terms windows and air are qualified by the two prefixes blind and frozen. There is a rich ambiguity, the state of being vague, unclear, of the expression, which makes the suffering of the poetess very real. Her heart is itself like a dark window where the fresh air does not blow. Images working on several layers of response or enrich this poem's texture. One of the favorite images is that of the window where she sits and enjoys the cool, refreshing breeze of the past. This recurs to the extent of becoming an obsessive image. The image highlights the lingering longing of the poetess for a peep into her past, resurrecting her hopes and desires. With the destruction of the old building, the windows were blind, only the heat of the reunion with the house would melt the ice and the window would be returned to old life. The crumbling of the old house and the death of the old woman also leave their mark on the poet. With them, her own life of innocence and beloved ideals crumbles. The poetry of Kamala Das is the quest for the essential woman, and hence the woman, the individual of her poems, assumes the various roles of the unhappy woman, the unhappy lady, the mistress of the lustful men, the reluctant nymphomaniac, the mute Devdasi, and the love-lorn Radha. Kamala Das was also named a confessional poet. Confessional poets struggle with emotional experiences that are usually tabooous. There is a merciless self analysis and a tone of total honesty. A critic, E.V. Ramakrishna, appropriately points out in her poetry, Kamala has always dealt with private humiliations and sufferings, which are the stock themes of confessional poetry. This poem is one of the finest poems in Kamala Das's maiden publication, Summer in Calcutta. Though short, it touches upon many favorite themes of her favorite. It is a poem of nostalgia, uprootedness, and the poet's eternal quest for love in a loveless world. Relationship with her grandmother is the poet's favorite relationship, and grandma is a symbol of harmony, affection, and security in her poetry. The poem also brings out the poet's loneliness and her fondness for her grandmother. Both the old lady and the ancestral home at Malabar brought to Kamala Das the feeling of belongingness. The poet has provided detailed information about the origin of this poem in her autobiography, My Story, in chapter 33. After the sudden death of my granduncle, followed by that of my dear grandmother, the old Nalpat house was locked up and its servants disbanded. The windows were shut gently as the eyes of the dead are shut. The rats ran across its darkened halls, and the white ants raised on its outer walls strange forms, totems of burial. After growing up, the poet shifted to another house which was far away from her beloved ancestral house. She still misses the place where she received love with great intensity. The memory of those days when she was loved chokes her with emotion. The poet recalls the death of her dear ancestress. That woman died, dwells on the difference the death made to the house and the poet's life. Grandma was the very life and soul of this house. When she passed away, even the house could not take the grief and withdrew into silence. It was an atmosphere of all round mourning and desolation. At that time, the poet was very young, a very young child who could not read books, but even at that age, she had a feeling of snakes moving among books, a feeling of deadness, horror, and repulsion. She recollects how the death of her grandmother had affected her as a child. The benumbing and chilling impact that was on her that she felt. Her blood lost all its power, and its color came to resemble the color of the pale, lifeless moon.